Okay, class, this is going to be the last half of chapter 28 on the Vietnam War and other things going on in the late 60s, early 70s. So the first thing I want to cover here is the subject of Agent Orange. I mentioned in the first slideshow on this chapter that the jungle was a real problem for our soldiers over there, the people that were going on search and destroy missions um, to find the enemy, and they were just victimized by the enemy all the time because our soldiers couldn't see where the enemy was in the jungle, and the jungle ran right down to the edge of the rivers, so they just had perfect cover. So Agent Orange was what the chemical companies, Monsanto, came up with to assist with this problem, and it is an herbicide, right? It kills vegetation. Um, first of all, it strips all the leaves off the trees and all the anything that's not trunk or something solid. They curl up and die immediately, and then all you have left is just a stick forest. The big leaves are all gone, and it's impossible for the enemy to hide there. So the good side of this story is that Agent Orange was very effective. It totally gave our men um, the ability to see the enemy. Enemy could not hide where they used Agent Orange. And they used it along the riverbanks. They used it in the jungle. They used it everywhere because the line of sight is so critical. So what the chemical companies told the Department of Defense was that Agent Orange was safe. It only killed plants. It wouldn't harm humans. Well, that was not true. Um, I'm not exactly sure when Monsanto found out that these chemicals were toxic to humans, but it was during the Vietnam War. They insisted that if it was, and this is what they say today, for all the yard and home chemicals that are sold in the Walmart and Home Depot, they say if you follow the directions properly, it will not harm you. Well, that means that you have to put on a hazmat suit if you're going to use these chemicals. I'm serious. You have to cover your head, your face, like a beekeeper's suit, right? Because the active ingredient in Agent Orange was 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. Now, D and T stand for, about 12 syllable chemical terms that describe the makeup of these sprays. 2,4,5-T was found to be so toxic that it was made illegal in the United States in the 1970s under the Environmental Protection Division of the executive branch. So it's gone. Can't buy any 2,4,5-T anymore, but you can buy 2,4-D. 2,4-D is the active ingredient in Roundup. It's the active ingredient in all herbicides, unless they're 100% organic and natural. It's the active ingredient in all herbicides that you purchase at the store today. If you use Roundup, of course, it's not full strength. It's only like 0.01% of the ingredients, but it's enough to kill whatever it contacts. That's a growth. Um, the problem with let me go back to finish this. The 2,4-D is also in all the weed and feed products, whether it's granular, whether it's liquid, however you put it on your lawn or your garden or your flower bed, wherever you put it. 2,4-D is the killing agent in all of that stuff. So, in your weed and feed, there's also fertilizer, but it kills the weeds, and the active ingredient in that part of it that kills weeds is 2,4-D, which was the main active ingredient in Agent Orange, along with 2,4,5-T. So what we've found about this product over the years is how dangerous it is. Now, this is how it was used in Vietnam. All of these pictures here are showing, I might have talked over that slide. Well, anyway, these pictures are all showing how Agent Orange was sprayed from helicopters, from the ground. It was from planes, flying or jet planes or whatever those planes are, like a crop duster. So the problem with this kind of spraying from the air is that it's impossible to regulate where the spray goes. Um, it went everywhere. It killed farmers' fields, their rice paddies. It contaminated the water. Yeah, it killed the jungle. It did a good job there, but you couldn't keep it in one place, right? So the refugees from Agent Orange fell to the United States Army to care for. And there were refugee camps in that part of Vietnam where this was heavily used because people could not live in their villages anymore. They didn't have any livelihood, so the army was feeding them and clothing them. But look at our poor soldiers there. They think this stuff is perfectly safe. And you know, Vietnam is hot. It gets up to 120 in the summertime and 99% humidity. So you frequently were going with as few clothes as you could possibly get away with, and then you're spraying this stuff at the same time. This is what it did to the forest and to the riverbanks. Um, you can see how effective it was. I mean, this is a miracle to our soldiers because they don't have to worry about sniper fire anymore. They can see booby traps out there where they're walking now because everything is clear. But they pay a high price for this in the end. Now, I've got a video on this week's module for you to watch that's going to explain more of the details about Agent Orange. One more thing I want you to know about is the effects of this chemical, the lasting effects of using this chemical in Vietnam. 650,000 Vietnamese still suffer from some chemical effects. It's in their water. It's in the it's down in the mud in the bottom of the river banks, river bottoms. It's in the soil. They still ingest it in their food. This never goes away. It's like nuclear material. It's got a half-life of 10,000 years or something like that. So this is the danger of these chemicals. If you look on the Roundup bottle, it'll say that that area is where you sprayed it is safe as soon as the spray has dried. That is not true. That is not true. The spray goes down into the ground. It gets into the groundwater. It's in the soil. You know how dogs and cats and other animals will munch on grass sometimes. Dogs do it because they have a little upset stomach or something. They're ingesting that poison when they do that. If they roll in the grass, even though it's dry, they will become poisoned and could die from that. My vet told me that using Roundup in people's yards is the #1 reason for cancer in dogs in the United States. And I have known people that they had their yard sprayed by an exterminator or whoever, and their dog went out there and rolled on it after it was dry, and that dog lost all its fur in the places where his body touched the ground. So this is nothing to fool with. I mean, our Vietnam vets have been dealing with problems from this since the Vietnam War. In Vietnam today, the #1 health crisis is birth defects. These are horrible birth defects, horrifying. They are almost don't look human. Some of them. I don't like to. I don't show these pictures because they're just too awful. But it's the only place in the world where these kinds of birth defects are found. which is one reason we know that this came from Agent Orange, because it was extensively used there and nowhere else in the world. The birth defects are like an ear on the back, on a child's back, or their face in their stomach. I mean, these are the most bizarre. They're not mutations, okay? They're not gene mutations. It's toxicity. So it's very bad stuff. Um, the American vets that fought, and civilians who served over there too at the same time, have a high rate of fatal diseases of all kinds. I'm going to talk about, show you a list here in a minute. And they have a high rate of birth defects. Down syndrome is one of them. There's They have not done enough study yet to find out all the repercussions, because the government fought paying veterans benefits for poisoning or for diseases that were caused by Agent Orange. They fought it from the end of the Vietnam War until 1995. The government kept saying, no, it's not true, it's not true, you're not sick because of Agent Orange. And so individual veterans had to sue get medical testimony, and had to sue for themselves individually. And finally, in the 1990s, the federal government realized they were paying out so much, and the more they paid out on each court case, the more liable they were to pay out more on the next court case. So they decided to just blanket cover diseases because of Agent Orange. They're not going to make people sue anymore. They're going to do the right thing. Okay. Now, the problem with that was, how could they deny our soldiers medical coverage for these diseases due to Agent Orange for all that time? Well, the reason they could do that is because it was going to be very expensive. It's always about the money. It's always about the money. So the federal government didn't want to shell it out. This is what really pisses me off, why I say we've got to support the troops, not just while they're in country, but for the rest of their lives, if they need that. That's on us. That's American taxpayers' responsibility. Okay. Of course, we never have recognized the birth defects in Vietnam that we were responsible for. We didn't recognize that we're responsible for them. We recognize that they're there. But it would bankrupt the United States government if we decided to cover all the medical expenses of children that were born with defects in Vietnam today. Most of them wind up in orphanages because the families don't want them or can't care for them. All right, moving on. This is just a small list of some of the diseases that medical science now attributes to Agent Orange. Most of them are different kinds of cancer, but not all. Some of them are heart disease, nerve damage. I don't think I have another slide of this, but down there at the very bottom, veterans with Lou Gehrig's disease. I don't know if you know what that is. It's something, well, it's nerve death. Okay, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's nerve death where your nerves literally start to die, so they can't move your muscles anymore, and you slowly become paralyzed. This is what Stephen Hawking had. You know, that brilliant astrophysicist that was in a wheelchair for 50 years of his life, and he's the longest living person with ALS. He's passed away now, but almost just insisted on living. I mean, lived by his strong will kept him alive. Because ALS, the death certificate, is a death diagnosis. There's nothing medical science can do for it. Not one thing. They don't have any treatments. They have a test that they can determine that that's what you have, and that's all they do. So my mother died from this disease, and I have to tell you that on my property here in Midwest City, which Mother and Daddy bought in 1949, as I was growing up, throughout my years up until mid-teenager, they used poisons in this yard everywhere for everything. Kill bugs, kill poison ivy, kill all kinds of invasive vines, just kill weeds. I mean, the chemical companies in the 50s and early 60s kept saying this is all safe. Wouldn't it be great to have a world without bugs? I mean, everybody hates bugs. Let's just kill them all. And that's what homeowners were trying to do. I know my dad was. The problem was they grew food where they had sprayed this stuff. They had big garden. Mother and Daddy both gardeners. We ate that food, you know, uh, all the time in the summer, and grew potatoes that we'd eat in the winter. And I think that that is a direct connection to my mother's death from ALS. Um, I hope I left in time and I'm not contaminated. It can take decades for your cells to begin to react because this toxin does not go away. It's stored in your body, um, and it's very likely is gonna catch you at some point in time. All right, moving on. Don't use Roundup. Bend over and pull the damn weed. The trauma of 1968. 68 was possibly the worst year in American history. I lived through it, so I'm probably a little bit biased. But I'm telling you, it went from bright sunny, uh, beautiful world from the 1967 was the summer of love and everything was peace and love and lots of songs on the radio about it. And, even though the Vietnam War was blazing, the people who opposed it were speaking out as loudly as possible. So there was a lot of hope there, very hopeful at the beginning of 68. By the end of 68, I mean, we were circling the toilet drain, for real. And it's been going down ever since. Very cynical, distrustful, especially of government, but of each other also. Loss of community bond. We live in a very cynical society today that if you're born and raised in it, you don't see it. But I lived through the change, and I do see it greatly. It's very sad. Um, so what happened in 1968 is the death of these great leaders who had such great values and lived those values, walked the walk. And it gave people hope that society could get better, that the United States could get better, that the world could get better. And then all of a sudden their lives are snuffed out by lunatics. Two guys that were just off the rails that killed them for no reason. No good reason for sure. I don't know if there's a good reason to kill anybody ever. But so in January, we have what's called the Tet Offensive. This was in Vietnam. North Vietnam invaded the South, but they did it undercover. In other words, they invaded through the tunnels, through the jungles. They, you couldn't tell who was North Vietnam and who was South Vietnam because they all look alike. So on one day, January 31st, 1968, every single American military installation in South Vietnam, every single one, along with the American embassy in Saigon, were attacked at the same time by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. I mean, it was horrible. We were shocked out of our socks. And the way it happened was this was a New Year truce. It was New Year's for Vietnamese. They go by a different calendar, different culture. So they honored the truces we asked for during Christmas Day. So we honored their truce that they asked for on their New Year's Day. But this year they violated the truce. They used it as cover for wide-scale attack. Some of the fighting continued on for 6 months of Americans trying to save the military installation, the Air Force base, the Army post, and hot fighting for 6 months. Lots and lots of killing. It's one reason why 1968 is the highest number of deaths for a year in Vietnam. So when the American people found out about this the next day or two and heard their war correspondents reporting on it, saw the video, um, Americans were just horrified, angered, because they had been told over the last 3 years, we're winning. We're winning the war. You know, we've got them on the run. It's going to be over especially that summer. It's going to be over any day. This is what Nixon campaigned on that summer, and the election was in November '68. Um, you elect me, and I'll end the war in Vietnam. You know, we're so close. We're going to be bringing those troops home. Just elect me, and we'll have peace. Well, Americans just wanted that so badly. Um, so in March, President Johnson announced he was not going to run for office again. He'd only been elected once, so he could have run a second term. The reason he didn't run was because of Vietnam. He had done so much good on the home side here for the downtrodden, expanded federal programs for people that can't provide for themselves, for the invalids, for the ill, for uneducated, lack of opportunity, all kinds of reasons. The Great Society program did more to help downtrodden and low economic level Americans than anything that's ever happened in this country's history. But he's not going to run again because he could not stand to listen to the Vietnam chanters, war chanters, anti-war protesters that circled the White House 24/7, and they chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many boys have you killed today?" And that drove him batty. I mean, since he got the war powers given to him by Congress, it was on his shoulders, the whole war. And he just couldn't deal with it. He had to go. So Nixon's elected in November. Anyway, in April, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis by a racist, white supremacist, James Earl Jones, who spent the rest of his life in prison. But that was the most positive voice of the civil rights movement, the leader of the civil rights movement, the man who had the ear of the American public and the American government. Then 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles on a campaign stop. He's running for president. Now, Robert Kennedy was an extremely compassionate man. He didn't get along with Johnson at all, but he supported the social programs that Johnson had promoted. Congress had passed. Kennedy had taken a stand against the Vietnam War just a few weeks before he was killed. King had done that same thing. They were against the war. They were campaigning, working against it. So Kennedy's assassinated by just a lunatic. It was too unbelievable. After his brother had died just 5 years before, now the second Kennedy is assassinated. Oh, it was unbelievable. And then things just started getting worse and worse and worse after that. The leadership was gone. The leadership had been killed off. And we were left with Nixon, who was nothing but a pack of lies. When he was elected, well, first of all, he campaigned on he'll end the war in Vietnam and he'll end the violence in the streets. Well, the violence in the streets were freedom of speech, right? It was a police attacking protesters who were exercising their constitutional right to protest. It was about control. And the mayors of these cities did not want the demonstrators out there. They did the same thing that they did in the South with civil rights demonstrators. They passed laws against public gatherings without a permit. And then once that law was in place, if you wanted to protest something and march down the street, you became a lawbreaker. So the police came after you. That was a huge part of the violence of the 60s was not the authority figures did not want to listen to the voices of the young people, the protesters, the ones who demanded change. So they just passed a law against them. And then that gave the police total control over those crowds, and that's where the violence came from. That's where the frustration of the demonstrators and the protesters came from when they reacted to the police brutality. It was a very, very bad time. In August, Nixon is nominated for the Republican presidential ticket, and in November he's elected on this law and order platform. And what he's talking about is, I'm going to stop free speech. I'm going to stop these protesters, which is in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. You have the right to protest. This is what makes America what it is, right? We can control the government by letting it know what we want and don't want, and voting that way. So Nixon promises law and order. The older generation voted for him in droves. The younger people didn't vote because they did not have a good candidate anymore after Kennedy was killed. So it was a bad election, and the young people began to lose hope. Without strong leadership and inspiring leaders, there were some, but not at the scale of King and Kennedy. So that's the beginning of the downward spiral, and we'll come to Watergate in just a few minutes, and that's going to be the other part of the downward spiral. But right now, I think I've already said that, so I'm going to move on. You can come back to it and look at it if you want to. So when Nixon took office in 1969, anti-war became war in the streets, much more violent. There's a lot of frustration among young men who don't want to go to war and fight for a country that they don't care about, and couldn't figure out why America cared about it. Really, that was a question on everybody's mind. Why are we over there? Well, yeah, stop the spread of communism, but I mean, how many young American men are going to die for the sake of this little tiny peninsula that we never even heard of before? There was a lot of animosity towards the war. Then, in 1969, Nixon, who's promised to end the war, is now invading a second country, Cambodia. Not invading yet, but he's began to bomb Cambodia, because one of the routes from North Vietnam to South Vietnam was through Cambodia. So they're trying to cut off that travel path for the North Vietnamese army. And then in April 1970, the United States invaded Cambodia. We sent troops in. Oh, that ripped the blanket right there. The American youth went on a rampage, college age. It was so bad that they closed college campuses across the country. Every college made this decision, just like they're making with the pandemic now. But every college considered whether this was worth staying open for, because there were so many demonstrations, so many protests on college campuses, and so many of them became violent. So they started closing college campuses around May the 1st, and that was a time when it took college, the semester went till about June the 1st. So they're going to lose at least a month from these schools. Their final exams are out the window. They just gave everybody the grade that they had when the college closed, and that's it, we're done, because it was dangerous. So the worst thing that happened during this time is Kent State. There were killings at Kent State. It was a college then in Kent, Ohio, where the students had been protesting for I think 2 or 3 days, and they had occupied the administration building for a while, which was one of the things you did to try and get news cameras to come in so you could tell your side of the story. And that was over, and they were assembled on a field or a grassy place out there on the middle of the campus, and the National Guard had been called out when they were occupying the administration building, and so they had disbanded and left. And so now the National Guard was told to keep an eye on these students that were gathered on the lawn, and they did, and they ordered the students to disperse, to leave, to go away. And the students turned and started leaving. Now you're facing National Guardsmen who are in full riot gear with rifles. It doesn't take a whole lot to convince you this is the time to go. So they're all leaving, walking away from the National Guard. The National Guard turns and walks the opposite direction, away from the students. Everybody's going their separate ways. All of a sudden, the line of 60 National Guardsmen stopped, turned, knelt down, and fired at the students. Now, to this day, those 60 National Guardsmen swear that they were not given an order. But how could they not have been? Why would a whole line of National Guardsmen stop at the same time, turn at the same time, kneel at the same time, aim and fire? That's just not something you would do just on a whim. Everybody at the same time in unison, like they had practiced it, which they do in drill. There were 5 students killed. 67 bullets were fired. 4 students were killed. 8 were wounded. 1 was paralyzed for life in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And there was absolutely zero threat from those students towards the National Guardsmen. They had been taunting them and hollering at them and hooting and stuff like that before, but no violence. They didn't throw anything at them. None of the students were armed. There was absolutely no reason for those students to die. And this really turned the country into mass chaos. To think that the college-age students are out on the street protesting the Vietnam War, and then the war comes to our college campus, it was unthinkable. Unthinkable. So events like this is what turned America against the Vietnam War. You could not justify that war in any way, shape, or form by 1970. And Nixon kept saying, it's coming to an end, it's coming to an end. Henry Kissinger was his negotiator. And Kissinger was in Paris. He lived there for 3 or 4 years. And every day they'd come out with news statements saying, the war's almost over. We've almost got a treaty. It'll end probably next week. In 3 months, troops will be coming home. It was all just a lie. So, finally, in 1970, the end of 72, early 73, Congress began to debate the War Powers Act that had been given to the president back in 1965. So Congress decided that that was a bad thing to do. It was a terrible mistake, and they're going to reverse that. So they took back war powers where it was supposed to be constitutionally in the Congress. And then the House of Representatives, which controls the budget of the United States, they're the budget keeper, they're the bookkeeper, they're the accountants, they began to cut off funding for the Vietnam War. That meant that the federal government no longer was purchasing guns and weapons and artillery and uniforms. And if you're not going to supply the soldiers with what they need, if you're not going to pay them, they're not going to fight. And that's what happened. That when funding was cut off by Congress, there was no other option but start bringing soldiers home, and that's what we started to do. 1973, a lot of the soldiers came home. That's when actually there was a truce signed. So it's an armistice, okay, not a treaty. An armistice, just, okay, we're not going to fire anymore. We're going to stop the fighting, okay? And then our troops started coming home at that point. And by 1975, we are abandoning South Vietnam. That's the best word for it. We're evacuated. The last stronghold there was Saigon, American Embassy in Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam. And we're taking, these pictures are, we're pulling our last civilians out of the embassy, and all those thousands of people back there in the background were South Vietnamese who supported the American presence in South Vietnam. They're not Viet Cong, or at least they say they're not, right? What they're trying to do is convince America to helicopter them out of there, because the communists from North Vietnam are at the edge of the city. They're coming. Once they get to the American embassy, it's going to get, demolished and everybody in it. So all these people are trying to get out. Well, we can't carry the whole city in helicopters. We overloaded the helicopters as it was, just getting out the Americans and their families and the staff of the embassy. So all those people that you see in those photographs that were left behind were killed by the communists when they invaded the city. It was a bloodbath, because all those people had not supported the communists of the North, and so they're going to pay the price for that. So by 1975, all Americans are out of Vietnam. The war is over. Vietnam reunites North and South. Now there is no more North, no more South. It's all one country, Vietnam. 58,000 Americans died. 300,000 were wounded. Many of them, the vast majority of them, their lives were shortened by either drug addiction or alcohol or contamination from Agent Orange or wounds that they received in country. So for all of that, Vietnam became communist anyway, and who cared, right? By 1975, nobody cared anymore. They cared about those men that had died. They cared about the reputation of America in the world. The reason we couldn't get out of Vietnam sooner, or didn't, was because both President Johnson and President Nixon refused to be the president who lost the first American war. It was pride. They let those young men be killed so they didn't have to admit this was a bad mistake. We should never have gotten in here in the first place. You see? So after all of that, it didn't matter at all. Sometimes we stopped communism from spreading, sometimes we didn't. In the end, it didn't really matter. The people who lived under communist regimes during the heyday of communism, many of them were very happy that way. Anyway, that's the end, and I'm very sorry that is the end. Laos and Cambodia both became either ruled by communists or by fascist kinds of dictators that went in and killed all their enemies. Anybody who disagreed with them, they died. So the whole thing was just for nothing.